Greetings, this is Greg. Was Nakajima's Ki-84 Hayate a match for the F4U Corsair? What about the Hellcat? In the previous video, we covered the maximum speeds of these planes and ended up here with this chart. As you can see, the Hayate, aka Frank, was easily faster than a Hellcat and about even with the Corsair, slower than the P-47N or November up at high altitudes. We're going to continue our performance discussion with climb rates, dive speeds, maneuverability, and then talk about the Frank's combat record. I want to start with climb rates because it's a pretty simple topic. This chart gives the climb rates in feet per minute. The Frank is the king here, except at some very high altitudes where the Thunderbolt's turbocharging system gives it the edge, and a very small corner of the chart where the Frank's first supercharger speed just runs out of steam. The Corsair and Hellcat, for the most part, just can't match the Frank's rate of climb. This is one of the Frank's strong points, and rate of climb is important in a fighter for interception, for escaping the enemy, and to gain positional advantage in a dogfight, sometimes to gain an energy advantage before the fight. So let's move on to dive speeds. The P-47N has a maximum of 564 miles per hour indicated airspeed down at low altitude. Up high, where it's Mach limited, it can reach 0.83. Grumman's Hellcat can reach 496 miles per hour in a dive, or when Mach limited, it can reach 0.79. I was pretty surprised when I first discovered the Hellcat's high Mach limit. That's a really good number for a naval fighter, and better than a lot of the land-based fighters. The Corsair could do 472 miles per hour, or Mach 0.73. Although the Corsair cannot match the dive speed of the Hellcat, it's important to note that the Corsair has dive brakes, which can be used to allow it to sustain a very steep dive angle without overspeeding. With those brakes out, it would be very hard for anything to follow a Corsair in a dive. The Nakajima Hayate can do 750 kilometers per hour in a dive. That's 466 miles per hour. So in terms of airspeed, which is what counts at lower altitudes, it's the slowest here, almost 100 miles per hour slower than the Thunderbolt, and only 6 miles per hour slower than the Corsair. In terms of Mach number, which is what counts at high altitudes, I don't know. The Japanese engineers and aircraft designers must have understood this, but I haven't seen any evidence that the information was properly communicated to the Japanese pilots. It probably was, just keep in mind I haven't found any information on that. Now, as an example, in most U.S. pilot manuals, they have clearly designated maximum speeds at various altitudes to avoid the Mach limits. U.S. pilots also had access to charts to figure out the numbers or to just help gain an understanding of Mach limitations versus airspeed limitations. I have a video on that subject that goes through the chart here if you're interested. German aircraft had markings on the airspeed indicators to clarify Mach limits. I don't see any of that with the Hayate or any other Japanese fighter. If this existed in World War II Japanese fighter aviation, it was not in the Hayate pilot manual. The only hint we have in that manual for Mach limit is a procedural discussion for a vertical dive. The highest Mach number reached if using that procedure is 0.63. What we do know is that in terms of low-altitude dive performance, the Hayate isn't bad. It's not quite up there with the faster diving U.S. airplanes, but it's at least in the ballpark. U.S. planes, except the Thunderbolt, couldn't simply dive away to escape because the dive speeds are so close that they're not going to be able to pull out of the Hayate's gun range in time. In terms of Mach number, we just don't know. 0.63 is not a limit, it's just the highest published number in the procedures for a vertical dive. The highest number I found for the plane is 0.66, which is from the US test, and it's not a clear Mach limit either. Reaching 460 miles per hour, which they did, at 5,000 feet is Mach 0.66, but it's not clear if it could do 460 at a higher altitude. For example, at just 12,500 feet, That would equate to about Mach 0.75. I think it's likely that the Hayate had a limit of around 0.75, which is about like a BF 109, but I'm basing that on secondary types of information and guesswork. Now, we do have reports from Corsair pilots saying that the Hayate was about equal to the Corsair in dive speed. We also know that above 300 miles per hour indicated, the Hayate's controls, specifically the ailerons, become very difficult to move. So a Corsair or a Hellcat could use their agility at high dive speeds to stay out of the Hayate's gun sight. No matter how I look at it, the Hayate has probably the worst overall dive performance here, but it's not terrible. Clearly the Thunderbolt or Hellcat will outdive it, but against the Corsair it's really close. By the book numbers, its dive limit is just slightly slower than the Corsair's at low altitudes, and up high I suspect its Mach number was slightly higher. Combat reports from U.S. pilots indicate that the Hayate's dive performance was about equal to the Corsair, so I suppose that supports my Mach 0.75 theory. So it was probably slightly faster up high in a dive than the Corsair, slightly slower down low, and overall inferior to the other two planes we're talking about. Maneuverability is a fun topic. This part of the video will get slightly mathy, not bad, I promise, but slightly. Keep in mind, if you're new to this channel, you're coming into a later video in a long series of videos. I went over many of these basic concepts, like calculating turn performance and Mach limits, in earlier videos. Starting with this video is a bit like walking into a movie at the end and saying you don't get it. Now, a lot of people new to the channel will still get it. It's basic aviation stuff, but keep in mind that my P-47 Thunderbolt series is specifically set up to walk anyone through all of these concepts, which is why I used that airplane for such a series. It allowed me to go over turbocharging, supercharging, intercoolers, fuel injection, Mach limits, political forces at work, and more, and it's all in an easy-to-follow playlist starting here. Back to this video, let's start with the basics. All four of these planes can perform all normal positive G aerobatics, loops, rolls, split S's, and so on. There are restrictions in the flight manuals for spins and snap rolls for all these planes except the Hellcat. Those are not normally useful combat maneuvers, but in some cases would give the Hellcat pilot an edge. The pilot's manuals for the other planes make it clear that they can recover from a spin if they get into one. However, the Japanese pilot manual for the Hayate has an interesting warning I've never seen before in regards to a World War II fighter. It says that spins or snap rolls can be harmful to the fuselage. That indicates to me a lack of structural strength, or it could be a lack of faith in the plane's construction quality. In either case, there is no such concern with the three U.S. fighters. Of course, none of these planes have true inverted fuel and oil systems. As with just about any other late war fighter, all can perform short-term 0 or negative G maneuvers and the engine will keep running, but they can't do that for more than a few seconds at a time. Neither the R-2800 engine nor the late war Hamari engine will cut out from negative Gs. These are not like the early float-type carbureted airplanes, but sustained negative Gs will cause the engine to cut out. I want to talk about the Hayate's turn performance as it compares to the late war U.S. fighters. The only official references to turn performance say that it was good, but not as good as a Zero or a Oscar. There are not enough pilot reports that mention the Hayate's turn performance versus U.S. fighters to be statistically meaningful, thus we're going to have to look at the numbers and come at it that way. The Hayate is limited to 5 Gs, which is the lowest I have seen for a World War II fighter. The U.S. Navy considers 7.5 Gs to be about the minimum requirement for a fighter plane. There have been some exceptions to that, but both the Corsair and Hellcat can use high enough G loads to black out the pilot, which is going to happen around 8 Gs. The Thunderbolt's G limit is not in the manual, but it can also exceed the pilot's. So for the U.S. airplanes, I'm going to use 6 Gs as the performance limit in regards to turn performance. They could pull more. You can find numbers as high as 9 Gs at lighter weights in certain Corsair manuals, but pulling that much, that high of a G load while flying precisely enough to line up for a shot would have been very difficult. So I'm using 6 Gs here again as the upper limit. Now, most viewers of this channel know that maximum turn performance is based on G limits and stall speed, those two things. So we have the G limit we're going to use. Next, we're going to need the stall speeds. The Thunderbolt November is heavier than previous models of the plane, but it also has more wing area and thus the same stall speeds of 115 miles per hour gear and flaps up and 100 with them down. These numbers are with the power off. We don't have power on numbers for the plane. I wish we did. I also wish we had numbers for flaps down, gear up, because they would be much lower. I'm sure Republic tested the planes in those conditions, but we don't have that data. If I meet up with the person from Fairchild that destroyed all those records, I'm going to have some harsh words for him. Actually, it's better that I don't. We don't want a repeat of that car transporter video. I'm going to use power off numbers as we have them for all the planes, and they're fine for comparative purposes. The speed at which the Thunderbolt will have its maximum turn rate and minimum turn radius with a 6G limit is 282 miles per hour. We get that by taking the square root of the G load and multiplying it by the stall speed. Ideally, we should be using calibrated airspeed, but I think the Thunderbolt's calibrated and indicated speeds are the same down at 115 miles per hour. Oh, and of course we have to convert that to knots because U.S. Navy. So the key number here is 245 knots. Let's plug that into the Navy's chart from Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators and see what we get. By the way, I'm calculating maximum turn performance at sea level. Up at higher altitudes, the numbers would change, radius would get bigger, and the rate of turn would decrease. But the relative performance between the planes in this regard would not. We know that with everything being held constant, that 80 degrees of bank will give us about 6 Gs. That doesn't mean you have to be at 80 degrees of bank to pull 6 Gs, but in a constant altitude turn, in coordinated flight at 80 degrees of bank, you're going to be pulling 6 Gs, about 6 Gs anyway. That's the way this chart is set up, so we have to use bank angle and speed to calculate this stuff. Now, here's a light blue line at 245 knots for the Thunderbolt. Note that the line intersects two different 80-degree bank lines. The upper one gives us turn rate, the lower one radius. So we get a radius of 900 feet and a rate of 25 degrees per second. Now I'm going to plug those numbers into an online calculator to make sure that I'm in the ballpark and I'm not messing up with the chart. So with the precision of modern computers, we can see that for 6 Gs we need 80.4 degrees of bank, which is a very precise number, but this is a math exercise with numbers typed into a calculator. Our turn radius will be 907 feet, and the turn rate, which is off the bottom of the screen here, is 26 degrees. Just trust me on that. So these numbers from the calculator are very close to our chart. Now, at any speed that's higher, we'll reach our 6G limit before the aircraft stalls, but the extra speed will increase the radius and decrease the rate. At any speed that's lower, we will stall before we reach 6Gs. So this is our best possible turn performance with a 6G limit. At lower speeds, we'll have to use a lower G limit to prevent a stall. I want to show an example of this. Here's a 4G turn. And in a 4G turn, we can fly more slowly, all the way down to 230 miles per hour. This will result in a decrease in our turn rate from 26 degrees per second to about 21. The radius will increase, but so slightly it's absolutely insignificant. The lesson here is that when the speed decreases below the optimum speed for turn performance, it doesn't have much of an effect on turn radius, but turn rate suffers quite a bit. Now, this is useful to know in flight simulators when you need to slow during a turn to force an overshoot. I'll talk more about this in an upcoming simulator video, and obviously there's some limitations. I mean, when you get right down near the stall speed, you really can't turn at all. Now, here I graphed the Thunderbolt's 4G turn onto the chart, and you can see the difference in turn radius is almost nothing. And on this type of chart, really impossible to graph accurately because it's so small. However, the difference in turn rate really shows up. That's important to understand. Now, let's get the other planes in there. The Hellcat's published stall speed is 62 knots. Judging from the trend here, I think we need to add 11 knots to that, which gives us 73 knots for calibrated airspeed. Still really low to the Thunderbolt's 99 knots. This allows the Hellcat to pull 6 Gs all the way down to 179 knots, way lower than the Thunderbolt's 245. Let's get the Hellcat on the graph in orange. The Hellcat is an awesome turn fighter with a maximum rate of about 36 degrees per second and a minimum radius of about 490 feet. Remember, it can't sustain that, but that's what it can do at its optimal speed for instantaneous turn performance at 6 Gs. I did put these numbers into an electronic calculator. I got the exact same turn rate and a radius 7 feet shorter. From here on out, I'm just sticking with the chart because it's an official document, accurate enough, and it gives that visual comparison of the planes side by side. So it's clear the Hellcat has far better instant turn performance than a Thunderbolt. No shock there, the Hellcat's one of the best turn fighters of the war. Now let's add in the Corsair. The published stall speed is 87 knots. We subtract 2 for calibrated and we get 85. Let's graph it in dark blue. The Corsair comes in with a radius of about 660 feet and a rate of 31 degrees per second, which is darn good. Not Hellcat good, but it's good. Now let's add in the Frank. Several US reports put the stall speed in the clean configuration with the power off at 102 miles per hour, which is 164 kilometers per hour, about 88 knots. I think this number is coming straight from the translations of a Japanese pilot manual. Here's the problem, and there are a couple of them. There's a note that says, with full equipment. Great, what does that mean? Thankfully, in another more complete translation, it gives a really good clue as to just what that means. The way I'm seeing this, these stall speeds allow for about 540 pounds of fuel and bombs. This is the version with the single centerline mounted drop tank. Now the tank itself must weigh something, but I'm going to call it a total of 550 pounds, which is probably on the low side by quite a bit. I want to stress that I could be completely wrong here. Maybe that 102 mile per hour / 164 kph number is without external stores, but that's not how it looks to me. I also have to ask if the 102 mile per hour number makes sense for a clean airplane. I know there's more to wing design than just wing loading, a lot more, but wing loading is still a rough indication of stall speed, and the Frank has a slightly lower wing loading than even the Hellcat and quite a bit lower than the Corsairs. So does it make sense that the Frank's stall speed would be higher than both? I just don't think so. Sure, the wing designs are different. The Hellcat's wing is not the same design as the Frank's, but the Japanese have a proven track record at this point of turning out wings that performed very well in regards to stall speeds and turn performance, including wings on earlier fighters from Nakajima. So I'm going to subtract that 500 pounds and adjust the stall speed for the reduction in weight. That's an easy calculation from AFNA. The weight of the plane with full internal fuel, ammo, and a pilot is 7,940 pounds. The overload numbers shown here are with dual drop tanks, but the Japanese manual we're using is for a plane with a single drop tank. So we add that 540 pounds we came up with earlier to get 7,940, or we add it to 7,940 and we get 8,480. So without that 540 pounds, the plane is 93.6% of the weight it is with the external stores. So we take the square root of 0.936, the new load factor, and multiply it by 102, and we get 99 miles per hour or 86 knots. Not much of a change and about identical to the Corsair's number of 85 knots. Another problem here, though, is that this is indicated airspeed, and I don't know what the calibrated airspeed was, so I'm just going to have to go with indicated, and that could be a pretty significant error here, and if so, it's probably an error that's working against the Frank in terms of turn performance, but we're going to have to move forward with it. So let's add the Frank to the graph. Remember that it's limited to 5 Gs, so our speed will be 192 knots at 78.5 degrees of bank on the chart. The Frank comes in on this chart with turn performance just very slightly inferior to the Corsairs. However, we still have to consider the use of flaps, power, and most importantly, sustained turn performance. From this point on, I'm going to focus on the Frank versus Corsair. I think that makes the most sense because the Hellcat can't catch the Hayate. The Thunderbolt can, at least at higher altitudes, but a Thunderbolt pilot isn't going to typically choose to dogfight with any Japanese fighter unless at very high altitudes. At mid or low altitudes, the Hayate will have an advantage in a turn fight with the Thunderbolt. There's just no question about that, so I don't think we need to talk about it too much. So in regards to the Corsair, flaps are going to be a factor here. So how about those flaps? The Hayate has Fowler flaps, which can be extended to 15 degrees at 270 kilometers per hour, which lowers the stall speed from 164 to 149, as seen here. If we do the weight correction, we get 144 kilometers per hour, which converts to 78 knots. The Corsair also has a maneuver position for its flaps. It can use either 10 or 20 degrees at speeds up to 200 knots, which brings its stall speed down to 79, which adjusts to 77 with the correction for calibration. That's 1 knot below the Hayate. Functionally, the stall speeds of these two airplanes are identical, and the advantages here are going to come down to the way the plane is loaded, how much fuel and ammo and so forth, at the time they encounter each other. That is, of course, assuming that the Hayate's indicated and calibrated airspeeds down in this speed range are the same, and I can't stress enough that we don't know that. Moving on, the Corsair does have an ace up its sleeve here. It can go to maneuver flaps at 200 knots. The Hayate has to slow to 146 knots before it can throw out that 15 degrees it can use. So let's go back to our chart. I erased the lines because we already saw that these two planes are essentially identical in instantaneous turn performance with the flaps up. At 200 knots, the Corsair can put out the flaps, and if it does that and goes into a 6G turn, which it can do at this speed with 20 degrees of flaps, we get a radius of about 620 feet and a turn rate of 31 degrees per second. However, the Corsair can actually pull this G-load at that flap setting down to 189 knots. At that point, I get 550 feet and 34 degrees per second, which is really good. When the Hayate's flaps are at 15 degrees and 146 knots, it's just not moving fast enough to pull to its 5G limit. It can only manage 3.5 Gs there, and that really holds it back. So it's not up there with the Corsair's turn rate, although in terms of turn radius, they're darn close. Now, as the Corsair slows through this turn, it maintains a small advantage until it reaches 146 knots, and from there on down, the two planes basically overlap each other on the chart. Let me put up one more line in light green to help us get a more clear overall picture. Here is the Hayate at 200 knots, which means, of course, the flaps are up. Now, above that speed, neither plane can use the flaps, although at very high speeds, the Corsair does have a small advantage because it can pull a higher G-load. Now, once the planes reach 200 knots, the Corsair can put the flaps out, and from there, it has a significant turn performance advantage, especially in turn rate, as the planes slow down. Now, as the planes slow, the turn performance will decrease until both planes have overlapping lines at 146 knots. So the way to think of this is that the Corsair enjoys a significant advantage right at 200 knots. That advantage then slowly decreases to parity when the planes reach 146. And from there on down, they're functionally identical. Assuming a horizontal turn fight, meaning that the Frank's pilot doesn't exploit the vertical for some reason. If the fight starts at high speed, there is a speed range in which the Corsair's nose will come around on the Frank, but the Corsair pilot doesn't have much time. At 200 knots, he has an edge in turn rate of about 5 degrees per second. That edge is going to decrease fast as drag will be really high in a 6G turn. If he doesn't get a shot in pretty soon, it's going to turn into a contest of sustained turn rates. Now with the flaps up, the sustained turn rates for these two planes are nearly identical, and the comparison will really depend on altitude. I explained how to calculate this in a previous video. I'm not going to do it here, not only because I already covered it in detail in another video and it's quite long, but also because in this case I simply don't need to. The key numbers for this calculation at sea level for the Frank and the Corsair are nearly identical. In rare cases like this, in which you have two airplanes with the same stall speed and the same top speed at a given altitude, then the sustained turn rates at that point are going to be very, very close. The best glide speeds come into play in these calculations, but we don't have that number for the Frank, and in any case it won't matter much anyway. Now, as the planes climb, there will be altitude ranges where one plane has the edge over the other, but at sea level they will be equal. Where the difference is going to show up is in sustained turn rates once the flaps come down. I'm very certain that's the point where the Frank will have the edge. I don't have the data I would need to calculate this properly. We would have to know just how much additional drag the maneuver flap settings add for each airplane. We don't have that information. However, by design and by their very nature, Fowler flaps add less drag for the amount of lift they create than the Corsair's NACA slotted flaps. Thus, even though I don't have all the data needed for the calculations, I think it's a certainty that the Frank will beat the Corsair in a sustained turn fight once the fight is down into the speed range where the Fowler flaps can come out. At that point, a lot of the Corsair's power is going to be used up dragging those big slotted flaps around the turn, and it's going to have to limit its G-loading to keep induced drag and thus total drag manageable. The Frank has to do that as well, but not as much because the Fowlers just don't create that much drag. That's the whole point of the Fowler design. So the Frank has two big advantages I think it can exploit versus a Corsair. The first is climb rate, and that's a big deal. Don't underestimate the importance of climb rate. It allows the faster climbing fighter to gain an advantage before the fight even starts. Then during a dogfight, if things are going badly, it allows the fighter to avoid the enemy's guns and reposition. Remember, these are World War II fighters, not modern jets that can point the nose straight up for an extended period of time. It's very hard to get your sights on an enemy that's out-climbing you in a dogfight. The Frank's other advantage is its sustained turn rate at low speeds, and these are two pretty big advantages. Now the Corsair has its advantages too. Roll rate at high speed, turn performance at high speed, turn performance between 200 and 146 knots, a little bit higher dive speed, a little bit, and of course, I can't stress this enough, a much higher G limit. The Corsair's main advantage, however, is that all the Corsair Dash 1s, at least when running at 60 inches of manifold pressure, have more or less this same excellent performance. The Hayates just don't. We're using an ideal Hayate for this comparison. So how is the Hayate's war record? Did its performance give the Japanese decent results, or was it just more fodder for the US fighters? That's a bit hard to determine because misidentification was rampant in reports from US pilots. Consider that the Japanese fielded a number of radial engine fighters during the war. In fact, all their frontline fighters, their single engine fighters, had radial engines except for the Tony, which I cover in another video, and the Tony II, which I might talk about another time. The Germans, by comparison, basically fielded only two single-engine fighters throughout the entire war, although with vastly different variants as time marched on. These two, the Bf-109 and the FW-190, were pretty easy to tell apart. In fact, each one was more likely to be confused with various Allied fighters than they were with each other. On the other hand, depending on just how you count them, the Japanese fielded about 10 different single-engine fighters, and many of these that operated in the late war period were pretty hard to tell apart. Here are some of those planes. Now, how many can you identify? And you're not under the stress of combat right now. Notice that they are all radials and all from the same time period during the war, and they all have a roughly similar look. I think you can see why it would be easy to incorrectly identify them. So when we read a report from a Corsair pilot saying that he shot down a George, we just can't accept that at face value. It could have been a Tojo, could have been a Frank, maybe even an Oscar. So let's run through these again more slowly with the Allied code names on them. I'm sure you understand the problem of simply reading U.S. combat reports and figuring out how often and how many Franks were shot down. Fortunately for us, someone has gone through the trouble of matching up the dates from U.S. reports with the now known locations of the Japanese squadrons and the types of aircraft they flew. I'm sure this was a huge amount of work, and my hat's off to the publisher of this book and the author of the relevant chapters. It seems from this book, and also it just makes sense, that very often Franks, Tojos, and Georges were confused with each other in these reports. After sifting through the data, the author came up with a 7-to-1 kill ratio for the Corsairs against the Franks. Now, that doesn't sound too good for the Frank, but consider that the Corsairs' overall kill ratio was 11 or 12-to-1. So that seems to indicate that the Franks' excellent performance made at least some difference. The primary factor working against the Franks, and there were many, but the main one was a lack of experienced pilots. The Japanese had two categories of pilots, and I've talked about this before. They were called Division 1 and Division 2. The Division 1 pilots were the experienced guys. Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, Darwin, Midway. Those were the Division 1 pilots. These were the pilots that reliably put munitions on target. Yes, the Japanese lost epically at Midway, but I would argue that was not due to a lack of skilled pilots. There were a bunch of other things going on there. Now, the one attack they did manage at Midway on U.S. carriers knocked the Yorktown out of action pretty quickly. After Midway, the Japanese started to run low on Division 1 pilots, and without them, the Division 2 pilots with less experience were just not living long enough to become Division 1 pilots. Thus, by the time the Ki-84 was ready for combat, very few Division 1 pilots were left. Japanese pilot training, and especially Army Air Force pilot training, was terrible. I've read numerous accounts of Japanese pilots in training being regularly beaten by their instructors. In an interview here on YouTube, a Japanese World War II veteran pilot named Isao Mochizuki, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, says, quote, "Every single day you would get slapped around. They hit you so much you couldn't eat any food or open your mouth at all sometimes." Unquote. Those conditions would make it really hard to seriously focus on your studies, which you have to do a lot to become an effective pilot. He goes on to describe the barbaric treatment of pilots in training. I'll post a link to that video in the description. Physical abuse and a general disregard for the trainee's life seemed to be a theme in the Japanese army of the era. Another great example can be found in Masahiko Kimura's book, which details his time in the Japanese army during World War II, as well as his life in other time periods. Now, he wasn't a pilot, but his account of his time in the Japanese army has a story that I think is really relevant here. At some point in the war, his unit was visited for training purposes by a master of Jukenjutsu. That's a Japanese martial art entirely focused on bayonet fighting. This was a real martial art. It was banned after the war by the Allies, but then was revived sometime after as Jukendo. If you've ever seen Japanese kendo, which is basically sword fighting, it's a lot like that, but with bayonets, thus a lot more stabby. Anyway, the Jukendo master was demonstrating his methods and asked for a volunteer, and nobody in the unit volunteered because apparently it was not unusual for people volunteering for such demonstrations to be killed. The unit commander, fearing his unit would be shamed if nobody stepped up, volunteered Masahiko Kimura. Now, Kimura had either never held a rifle or never held a rifle, a practice-type rifle, depending on how you read the translation of his book. He was in air defense. He was in a unit that operated large guns shooting down high-flying airplanes, so using rifles wasn't their thing. Kimura was very concerned as he faced off against the Jukenjutsu master. He knew he was seriously outclassed in this fight and could be killed. However, Kimura was an experienced martial artist himself. He was a practitioner of judo, which is basically Japanese wrestling, but while wearing a jacket, they call it judo-gi. Kimura was probably the best judo man or judoka in the world at the time. Kimura threw the rifle and charged in very fast, so that as the Jukendo master deflected the rifle, Kimura was able to tackle him and started to administer a thorough beatdown. This led to a chain of events that allowed Kimura to survive the war. He ended up befriending a number of U.S. soldiers, including the best boxer in the U.S. Marine Corps, from whom he took boxing lessons while instructing occupying U.S. soldiers in judo. To this day, Kimura is quite famous in the martial arts world. In fact, there's a submission hold named after him. It's to the point that people don't realize that Kimura is a person, not a submission hold. Anyway, the point is that Japanese Army training, including Army Air Forces training, seemed to focus on brutality and ego boosting for the instructors. It's almost like a hardcore hazing mixed in with some low-quality flight instruction. Now, before U.S. entry into the war, this didn't hurt them too much because the pilots lived long enough to gain through experience what they didn't learn in training. Once the U.S. entered the war, and especially from midway on, that changed. By the end of the war, a typical U.S. pilot going into combat had at least 300 hours of flight time, which included navigation, gunnery, aerobatics, everything a new fighter pilot would need. Japanese pilots had about 100 hours. In mid to late 1943, the Japanese began conscripting, that means drafting, university students who had previously been excluded from mandatory military service. I made a video about the factors that seem to be shared by successful World War II fighter pilots, and scholastic success is not one of those common traits. The high-scoring aces from World War II ranged from people with high scholastic credentials to people who had been repeatedly kicked out of school. Yes, I know there's a modern study from universities saying that what pilots need is more university. I could pick that study apart if I wanted to waste the time, but I think most people here are smart enough to recognize a study created in someone's own self-interest for what it is, an attempted cash grab with zero regard for reality. In any case, university education or not, the low-time Japanese pilots were just getting slaughtered, and many of them ended up as kamikazes. I went through the records of a lot of Japanese aces, and I couldn't find any that came from this conscription effort, not a single one. From late 1944 on, the Frank could be found fighting with the Japanese in most of the areas where the action was intense. However, we can distill the plane's usage down into three basic roles. They flew in defense of the home islands against B-29 raids. They defended the Kyushu region of Japan, hopefully I'm saying that right, and especially the airfields in that region from U.S. aircraft. And they participated in the defense of Okinawa. I believe the Kyushu region of Japan also included some parts of what is now South Korea for air defense purposes. In any case, the Franks did fight over Korea. In all three of these roles, they encountered U.S. fighters. In regards to the defense of the home islands, attacking B-29s was a tough job. The B-29s could fly relatively high and fast for a bomber, although at some point General Curtis LeMay started using them at lower altitudes. There is a very good discussion about this in the documentary Fog of War, which you really should watch. The short version, though, is that LeMay felt that the increased losses per raid were worth the additional destruction resulting from the improved accuracy. The idea being that more lives lost now will mean a quicker end to the war and ultimately fewer lives lost total. I'm hugely paraphrasing, but that's the way I see it, that's the way I see his viewpoint. We're not going to go down that path of discussion in this video. I'm just pointing out that not all B-29 raids were up at super high altitudes in the daylight. The Frank was one of the few Japanese fighters that did have the performance needed to intercept the B-29s. Even though the Frank supercharger was a single-stage unit, the plane was still reasonably fast up at 25 or 30,000 feet. Now, it's not a match for a P-47N or a P-51D up at those altitudes, but it has enough performance to attack B-29s, and especially the version with 30mm cannons has enough punch to knock one of them down in a single pass. The problem is, once again, lack of experienced pilots. The Frank is at best going to get one pass, and aerial gunnery is trickery. The B-29s, on the other hand, were defended by machine guns and cannon fire, and had the most advanced gunnery system in the world on an aircraft in World War II. They could hit a target at 1,000 yards, a fighter plane, twice the range of a typical U.S. bomber like a B-17. The sights in the B-29 accounted for bullet drop, range, relative wind, everything making the gunner's job relatively easy. Some B-29s were shot down by Franks, but we don't have solid numbers on just how many. We do know that only 147 B-29s were shot down during the entire war, and it's likely about 2/3 of those or more were shot down by anti-aircraft fire. Those numbers are very low. The real threat to B-29s wasn't so much enemy fighters or ground fire, it was the B-29's Curtiss-Wright engines. These were rushed into development and pressed into service just too soon. They were made with a lot of magnesium, which saves weight, and that's great until it catches on fire. You don't want to be near a magnesium fire. In the B-29, such a fire would burn through the relatively ineffective firewall and melt the wing spar in no time. The Curtiss-Wright engines were full of problems, not the least of which is they tended to catch on fire. This could be an entire video, but the short version is that the Curtiss-Wright R-3350 had so many problems that it essentially knocked Curtiss-Wright out of the engine manufacturing business. The company is still around today, but not making aircraft engines. Now, ultimately, the B-29 became at least a decent airplane, and by World War II airplanes, the only airplane capable of flying certain missions, especially bombing Japan. Now, if the Japanese could have attacked unescorted superfortresses with a 2-to-1 advantage, and with the Franks flown by skilled pilots, I think they would have knocked them down in numbers comparable to the Luftwaffe against the 8th Air Force in 1943. However, there are too many ifs there for that to be realistic. They didn't have the numbers, they didn't have the pilots, and the P-47 Novembers were escorting B-29s very late in the war. In one engagement, U.S. Lieutenant Oscar Perdomo, while flying a Thunderbolt November, became the war's last ace in a day when he shot down 5 enemy planes on August 13th, 1945. That's after the second atomic bomb was dropped, but just before the Japanese surrender. Lieutenant Perdomo shot down one Type 93 Willow, which was normally used as a training aircraft. However, these were also being used as kamikazes late in the war. In fact, one of these biplanes sunk the USS Callahan about 2 weeks earlier, so they were not to be taken lightly. Lieutenant Perdomo's flight of 38 Thunderbolts encountered about 50 Japanese aircraft. That was a huge number for this point in the war. And he shot down 4 of them, which he thought to be Oscars, ironic because his first name is Oscar, but his gun camera footage showed they were in fact Franks. The Thunderbolt versus Frank question in a traditional dogfight, and assuming equal pilot skill, is really all about the altitude of the fight. However, most fighters don't see the plane that shoots them down, meaning typical dogfighting is not as meaningful as we tend to think. And that factor gives the Thunderbolt November a huge advantage because the Thunderbolt cannot be, well, let's say it this way, the Frank can't sneak up behind a Thunderbolt and shoot it down because the Thunderbolt's tail warning radar will alert the pilot. The opposite is not true. The Thunderbolt can easily sneak up on the Frank. Now, the Ki-84s, in both their defense of Okinawa and in their defense of the Kyushu region, encountered Corsairs in both offensive and defensive roles, probably a couple of dozen times, which is quite a bit when you're talking about encounters with the Frank. Now, the Corsairs were tasked with defending carriers and other targets from kamikazes, and the Franks were tasked with escorting the kamikazes. We know the Corsairs had a large kill ratio over the Franks, although we, again, can't pin down exact numbers. Reports from the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps pilots point out that pilots of the Ki-84s did not use the plane's abilities to any extent. They tended to make wide turns, and the only escape maneuver they seemed to know was the split S. This is all in harmony with the idea that it wasn't the design of the Frank that was the problem. It was the lack of well-trained and experienced pilots, as well as quality control problems. There were some Ki-84 aces who had some successes against Corsairs. The prevailing opinions of these and the U.S. pilots seems to be that in a 1 versus 1 battle, the planes were close to being equal, with the deciding factor being pilot skill and positional or energy advantage at the start of the fight, which makes sense considering the relative performance of the two planes. In summary, the Frank had the performance to match the late war US fighters. Although I didn't talk about it in this video, Japanese tactics had started to improve as well. They now flew in groups of 4, 2 pairs instead of the 3-ship formation they stuck with for way too long. It's likely the Japanese radios improved as well, but I don't have any real hard information to back that up. However, the Frank had some real drawbacks. The pilot had the additional workload of manually pumping up fuel pressure for high G turns. Furthermore, the handle of that pump was on the right side of the cockpit, making simultaneous pumping and flying difficult. The Frank doesn't have a cockpit heater, at least not normally. That's going to be a real drawback if it has to fight up at higher altitudes. Now, the low max G limit for the Frank, the note about damage from a spin, indicates to me that the plane was structurally weak, at least in terms of the forces that are going to be imposed on it while maneuvering, and at least as compared with US or even other Japanese fighters like the Ki-81 Tony. These downsides are pretty minor, though, compared with the lack of reliability which plagued these airplanes. Now, I'm sure that some of that was due to the inexperienced pilots flying them. Operating a highly strung, air-cooled engine requires some effort and understanding, and especially one that's so close to the knock threshold all the time. The Franks had a lot of engine and landing gear failures, and I have to think at least some of that was due to a lack of pilot experience, lack of pilot skill, and not just the quality control problems at Nakajima. I've put the manuals related to this video in my Patreon section. Some of the manuals I'm not free to distribute, so in those cases, I put in the pages I showed on screen in this series, the speed charts and so on. Patreon members get early access to many of my videos, access to the manuals I use, and get to vote to help steer the direction of the channel. Oh, and they do get to watch the videos ad-free when they're initially put up in the Patreon section. So please consider joining. That's all for now, and have a great day.